Vladimir Putin will eventually be acknowledged as one of the most consequential and visionary leaders of the 21st century. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified, where we bring in perspectives you do not see or hear in the mainstream media. I'm your host, S.L. Canton. Today's topic of how Putin made Russia great again might be controversial, especially for Western audience, but let us have an open mind and explore this in depth. Introduction. The US has been consumed by virulent Russophobia for a decade, and the entire US establishment demonizes President Vladimir Putin in unison. There's no free speech for American and European prostitutes when it comes to Russia. Every journalist, TV anchor, academic, and think tank must hate Putin and portray Russia as a threat to the collective West. Thus, the truth has been buried under 60 feet of propaganda and censorship. The fact is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, globalists fantasized about breaking up Russia further and erasing it from history. Thus, when Putin came to power, he disrupted the American plan, saved Russia, and began the task of restoring the civilizational state to its greatness. Let us look at what has been hidden from much of the public. There are also valuable lessons for India and other countries of the global South. The real US-Russia conflict is about geopolitical power struggle for world domination, which involves hundreds of trillions of dollars, massive egos of Machiavellian globalists, and nations driven by memory of the past and visions of the future. End of history. To understand the psychology of the powers that be who rule the West, one must go to 1989 when the USSR started to implode with US-funded revolutions spreading all across Eastern Europe. Even China was not spared, as seen in the Tiananmen Square protests. That year, an American scholar, Francis Fukuyama, wrote an article titled "The End of History," which claimed that American-style capitalism and democracy had decisively won the ideological battle. The world was going to become a replica of the United States of America. Everyone will drink Coca-Cola, buy Nike, watch CNN, drive General Motors, open up their country to Wall Street, and vote for a pro-US candidate. Furthermore, Americans had also just invented the World Wide Web, with which the deep state could monitor and control the entire world. There was no other alternative. It was the end of political history and the beginning of a truly global empire. This idea was so tantalizing that US elites funded Fukuyama to write an entire book on the same theme 3 years later. Shocking Betrayal. All through the world's history, empires have rarely dismantled themselves in a peaceful manner. However, the Soviet Union did just that. Demonstrating unprecedented goodwill, Gorbachev and others agreed to end the Cold War and collaborate with the West on architecting a new, peaceful future. However, that turned out to be an extremely naive attitude. The US had no plans to coexist peacefully with a Russia that would still be the largest country on earth in terms of area, and one that would still have thousands of nuclear weapons. Nope. Instead, the US had bigger plans. Crush the Russian economy with shock doctrine, destroy the Russian military, and dismember the nation forever. To ensure military supremacy, the West also blatantly and repeatedly lied with so-called ironclad guarantees to Russian leaders about NATO not expanding 1 inch eastward in the future. There was one more strategic imperative to conquer Russia. If Russia falls, China will be the next. Get the bear, you get the dragon, and thus you get the world. But here's the kicker. The globalists did trap the bear in 1991 when the USSR failed. However, rather than befriending the bear, they caged it and then starved, tortured, and humiliated it for the next 8 years. That's when the bear tore down the cage and fought back, conquering Russia from within. Not only Russian leaders, but Russian people also welcomed the new friendship with America. Everything American was considered wonderful. American TV shows, American products, and American economists took over Russia. What better way to achieve prosperity? However, what happened the next few years was a planned demolition of unimaginable proportion. The biggest theft of the century happened in Russia in the 1990s, and the perpetrators were Wall Street shysters who promised miracles of capitalism, but instead dismantled the entire country. We created a virtual open shop for thievery at a national level and for capital flight in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars and the raping of natural resources and industries on a scale which I doubt has ever taken place in human history. Thus spoke Wayne Merry, a U.S. Embassy official in Moscow during the 1990s and now a senior fellow at American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. In 1992, the first year of so-called reforms introduced by globalists, Russia's inflation skyrocketed to 2,500%. This had a double whammy effect. One, the price of food and other things went up 25-fold. Second, savings of pensioners were completely wiped out. What comes after the devaluation of the currency? Selling Russian assets to American and European investors at a great discount. In the name of privatization, Russia was put up for fire sale. Everything you can imagine, oil and gas fields, gold and diamond mines, airlines, media, factories, etc., was sold at an infinitesimal fraction of its fair price. A handful of Russians, future oligarchs who were carefully selected by the U.S., ended up with assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars. In exchange, each Russian got a share worth $7. The U.S. taxpayers even subsidized this disgusting racket. It was sheer economic terrorism. The U.S. also installed all the key influencers surrounding the new President Yeltsin. The two most corrupt insiders were Anatoly Shubais and Igor Gaidar, who had roles such as the Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister. They implemented the economic shock therapy and ruthless privatization programs. According to the New York Times article in 1999, Shubais might have been the most despised man in Russia. A few selected American oligarchs and institutions were also allowed to enjoy this plunder. For example, George Soros became a significant shareholder in Novolipetsk, Russia's second largest steel mill, Svyazinvest, the telecommunications giant, and Sidanko Oil, whose reserves exceeded those of Mobil. The privatization drive that was supposed to manifest the magical benefits of free market turned out to be crony capitalism or tycoon capitalism designed for the benefit of few corrupt oligarchy. These kleptocrats didn't even keep their money in Russia, but moved them abroad to banks in London, New York, and Switzerland. The Mafia in charge of this biggest robbery of the century were known as the Harvard Boys: Larry Summers, Jeffrey Sachs, Robert Rubin, and others. Harvard played a mind-bogglingly key role in shaping Russian politics, economics, and even the legal system in the early 1990s. It all started with Harvard Institute for International Development, which became the point organization that not only dictated U.S. policies for Russia, but received Russia's foreign aid from the U.S. government. In Russia, the Harvard mob established numerous organizations such as the Russia Privatization Center, which was the gateway to most of the aid from the US, World Bank, Europe, Japan, etc. And the head of this powerful organization was none other than Shubais, the deputy Russian prime minister and darling of Wall Street we discussed earlier. Sometimes the Russian government would hold auctions of state assets where Harvard endowment was allowed to bid without competition and buy assets for pennies on the dollar. To make the long story short, Russia experienced the Great Depression for the next 8 years. Hyperinflation, 40% drop in GDP, mass unemployment, widespread poverty, soaring suicides. The reforms turned out to be a satanic shock therapy. Meanwhile, pro-West oligarchs and traitors such as Michael Friedman, Vladimir Guzinski, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Boris Berezovsky, and Roman Abramovich practically became instant billionaires. Americans like Bill Browder, the anti-Putin warrior behind the Magnitsky Act, also enjoyed the spoils of the plunder. By the way, all these treasonous oligarchs and politicians eventually left Russia and ran to the West, mostly to the US, UK, and Israel. Under this Western heist, thousands of Russian factories were simply shut down. Even Russia's production of wheat, oil, and gas fell by half compared to the communist Soviet era. To solve this fake economic crisis, America's vulture capitalists prescribed more illogical and cruel advice: slash government spending, lay off more workers, and raise taxes. This neoliberal solution predictably led to only more misery for most Russians. In the 1990s, many Russian workers often did not get paid for months. There were 2 million Russian children who essentially became orphans. Suicide rates among men skyrocketed, and the life expectancy of men fell to 58. Between 1991 and 1999, Russia's population decreased by 8 million. In 1998, Russia defaulted on its debt to the IMF and Western financiers. Bank interest rates soared to 120%, and the stock market collapsed. The default itself was bogus because the amount owed was only about 40 billion, which is nothing compared to the trillions of dollars of natural resources that Russia has. Then, to protect the value of ruble, Wall Street forced Russia to sell off its foreign exchange reserves and gold reserves. When all the reserves were gone, the ruble still fell 80%. The Russian military was in shambles and was badly losing wars to Islamic terrorists in Chechnya and Dagestan. Oh, these terrorists were the same mujahideen from Afghanistan and were still armed by the US. To add insult to the injury, in 1999, the West bombed Serbia, Russia's staunch ally, and also gave NATO membership to Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, threatening Russia's national security. Who was the clueless leader during those fateful years? Boris Yeltsin, who was surrounded by traitors with allegiance to Washington, D.C. and Wall Street. As Bill Clinton bragged to Tony Blair, the first thing we have to do is get Chernomyrdin confirmed as Russia's prime minister. I will see what I can do over there and work like hell to influence the Russian parliament. And when Boris Yeltsin was about to lose in the 1996 election, Bill Clinton arranged an IMF loan that went into Yeltsin's campaign coffer. And U.S. campaign experts flew into Russia and engineered a resounding victory for Yeltsin. The U.S. media gloated about the American meddling in Russian politics with titles such as Yanks to the Rescue and Rescuing Boris. In 1999, Boris Yeltsin called up Bill Clinton to tell him that Vladimir Putin would be his hand-picked presidential successor months before anyone in Russia knew. And he was virtually asking Bill Clinton for a nod of approval. NATO expansion, not 1 inch forward. Empires do not collapse peacefully. However, that's exactly what the Soviet Union agreed to do in the late 1980s. It was an extraordinary goodwill intended to foster global peace. However, while the Soviets were disarming themselves, they wanted guarantees for their own security. Thus, in 1990, every major Western leader assured Russia numerous times that NATO would not expand after the dissolution of the USSR. This included US President Bush, the senior, German Chancellor Kohl, French President Mitterrand, UK President Thatcher, and NATO Secretary General Warner. The first hurdle was unification of Germany. So the West agreed that the changes in Eastern Europe and the German unification process must not lead to an impairment of Soviet security interests. Therefore, NATO should rule out an expansion of its territory towards the east, i.e., moving it closer to the Soviet borders. Later, U.S. Secretary of State Jim Baker would repeat his famous phrase not once, but 3 times. There would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction or NATO forces 1 inch to the east. Ideally, NATO should have been dismantled when the Soviet threat expired. However, not only did the globalists maintain NATO, but they kept expanding it. In 1996, US President Bill Clinton brought up NATO expansion, and a lot of American experts were aghast. 50 famous Americans, including U.S. senators and the infamous former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, signed an open letter opposing NATO expansion. Amazingly, another staunch opponent of NATO expansion was George Kennan, the very architect of the Cold War containment policy vis-a-vis USSR. The man who fought the Soviet Union for 45 years wrote in the New York Times, "Expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era." But the imperialists dreamed of full spectrum and global dominance. Thus, in 1997, the US and NATO invited Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic to join NATO. And these countries officially joined in 1999. And 13 more countries have been added to the NATO empire since then. Obviously, NATO expansion, which includes U.S. military bases and missiles on Russian border, threatens the security of Russia. Putin to the rescue. Such was the bleak state of Russia when Putin was appointed as the acting president on December 31st, 1999. And nobody was prepared for what he would accomplish over the next decade or so. He started by removing corrupt oligarchs and taking control of the country. Putin improved Russia in a holistic 360-degree way, improving the economy, turbocharging industrial production, bolstering the military, fostering mutually beneficial relations with Europe, cementing strategic partnership with China, re-establishing China as a great power, and making Russians proud again. This is why the US hates him so much. Under Putin, Russian GDP grew a whopping tenfold from 200 billion in 1999 to over 2 trillion by 2013, when Russia became the 5th largest economy in the world by PPP GDP. This is why the globalists orchestrated the Maidan coup in Ukraine in 2014 and then started to wage vicious hybrid wars against Russia. At the same time, Putin brought down inflation, which was wildly out of control in the 1990s, from 2,000% in the early 1990s to 120% in 1998 to 2.4% in 2019. Now, even after the extraordinary US-EU sanctions since 2022, Russia's economy has kept growing and has surpassed Germany as Europe's largest economy in PPP GDP. While the US debt to GDP grew from 56% to 125% between 1999 and 2023, Putin did the opposite. He reduced Russia's debt from 100% to 15% of GDP. There are now 160 countries in the world that have higher debt to GDP ratios than Russia. This is a phenomenal achievement. Remember that Russia had virtually no foreign exchange reserves and very little gold reserves when Putin took office. He replenished the coffer and made the Russian economy quite immune to downturns and attacks from Wall Street shysters. Russia now has the 6th largest foreign exchange reserves as well as the 6th largest gold reserves in the world. Yes, the US and the EU have illegally confiscated much of Russia's foreign exchange, but that money will be eventually returned with interest. That Putin has managed to outsmart the richest and most powerful globalists for more than a decade is the best testament to his success. Look at some of the headlines from 2014 to 2016. Putin watches Russian economy collapse. That was from the Time magazine in 2014. Putin meets economic collapse with purges and broken promises. Newsweek 2015. For Russia, the oil collapse has Soviet echoes. Wall Street Journal 2016. Lights out for the Putin regime. Foreign Affairs 2016. Russia is seriously running out of cash. CNN 2016. Similarly, since the proxy war in Ukraine started, all the gloom and doom predictions by American pundits and politicians have been embarrassingly wrong. Ruble will turn into a rubble, famously predicted Biden in 2022. The mind-boggling number of sanctions, the theft of Russia's foreign exchange reserves, and the expulsion of Russian banks from SWIFT were supposed to decimate the Russian economy. Well, what happened? Russia's economy kept growing and surpassed Germany as Europe's largest economy. Russia's industrial production ramped up and is now manufacturing more artillery shells than the US and the EU combined. This is, by the way, one of the key reasons Russia is winning the battles on the ground in Ukraine. As for the US, it found out that it can print money, but not 155 millimeter artillery shells or gunpowder. Going back, under Putin, Russia's oil production quickly doubled from 1999 to 2015. Russia has also set records in grain production and has become number one in export of wheat, which again is quite an accomplishment considering where Russia was in 2000. Putin has also smartly rejected GMO and wants to make Russia the premier exporter of natural and organic food. When it came to national security and military, Putin did the impossible. He defeated the CIA-armed jihadists in Chechnya and stabilized Russia. Then he quickly rebuilt the Russian military, which soon produced world-class weapons and even surpassed the US in hypersonic missile technology. Russia's new fighter jets, tanks, and missile defense systems are arguably better than the American counterparts. When the US tried to destroy Syria, Putin intervened and destroyed the NATO-funded terrorist groups such as the ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Similarly, in Africa, many countries are aligning with Russia and kicking out American and French militaries. In Ukraine, of course, the Russian military has been single-handedly facing the entire might of American and NATO weapons, intelligence, spies, and mercenaries. This is simply astounding given that the collective annual military spending of the West is 20 times bigger than that of Russia. Finally, while the West has become anti-religion, anti-spirituality, and anti-traditionalism, Putin has done the opposite by rejecting cultural Marxism. Putin has built over 10,000 churches and monasteries in the last decade. Putin has also passed laws to protect children from degeneracy and brainwashing. Russians will no doubt benefit from such efforts in the long run. Considering the paths that the USA and Europe are on, it will not be hyperbolic to say that Russia might be the savior of Western civilization. Putin's geopolitical vision. Above all, Putin is an intellectual and one of the greatest geopolitical minds of modern times. You never see him resort to demagoguery or sensationalism. He's also extremely disciplined and diplomatic. For example, he always refers to Americans as our partners, despite all the deranged and treacherous actions of US elites. Unlike Western leaders who are good at only reading teleprompters, Putin can do long interviews and press conferences, sometimes lasting 2 hours without any notes. Putin also hired the smartest people like Sergei Lavrov to handle foreign policy. Putin is a big-picture visionary as well as a smart, tactical person. In 2001, he spoke in front of Germany's parliament in fluent German language and encouraged the Europeans to forget the Cold War and work towards a new security architecture. Later, Putin developed trusted relations with numerous European leaders such as Schroeder, Merkel, Berlusconi, and others. Then, Russia worked with Europe to build a vast network of oil-gas pipelines. Good trade is the foundation of peace, unless, of course, it is sabotaged by the empire of chaos. That Europe ended up as a spineless vassal of the US was beyond Putin's control. In 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Putin talked about the dangers of and the end of a unipolar world. He was a decade ahead of all the pundits. Here are some excerpts from Putin's speech in 2007. What is a unipolar world? However one might embellish this term, it refers to one type of situation, namely one center of authority, one center of force, and one center of decision-making. It is a world in which there is one master and one sovereign. This is pernicious not only for all those within the system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys the unipolar power from within. We are seeing a greater and greater disdain for the basic principles of international law. No one feels safe because no one can feel that international law is like a stone wall that will protect them. Of course, such a policy also stimulates an arms race. We must seriously think about the architecture of global security. Putin also warned against NATO expansion in that speech and warned about the dangers to Europe's security. He admonished the US over missile deployments, unilateral withdrawal from treaties, and inviting Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Putin's entire speech was factual, intellectual, and visionary. Of course, Europeans and the European puppets listened but did nothing. Over the last 2 decades, Putin has successfully played defense against a myriad of subversive attacks by the US. For example, the US blocked many potential Russian pipelines and coerced many European countries to turn down mutually beneficial deals. Putin successfully served the Turk Stream pipelines and avoided the American trap for hostility with Turkey. When the US tried to drive a wedge between Russia and Japan, Putin met with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe 20 times to try to end all the residual conflicts between the two nations. As for the Nord Stream pipelines that have been blown up by the rogue American empire, they could hopefully be built again in the near future. The deep friendship between Putin and Xi Jinping is not a marriage of convenience, but rather a long-term partnership for a multipolar world. The two leaders have met more than 40 times. Just 2 months after being inaugurated as the president in 2000, Putin went to China to solidify Russia-China relations. Why? Because Putin understood the biggest trend of the 21st century, the rise of Asia. He envisioned the rise of China when the US media were busy writing endless articles about the impending collapse of China. To establish a long-term customer for Russia's immense energy, Putin embarked on massive projects of gas pipelines to feed China. All these efforts have created a partnership without limits between Russia and China. This friendship and informal alliance have helped Russia withstand the shock and awe sanctions of the US, EU over the last 2 years. Similarly, Putin has maintained a solid relationship with India, which has become a significant buyer of Russian oil over the last 2 years. Another remarkable diplomatic achievement is how Putin turned around the Russia-Saudi relations. Now, Saudi Prince MBS is a good friend of Putin, and they work together in the OPEC Plus setting. This is quite stunning, considering that during the Cold War, Saudi Arabia played a key role in attacking the USSR by deliberately bringing down the oil price in the 1980s. Putin has successfully begun the expansion of BRICS, which will be the true game changer this century. Last year, 5 new countries joined BRICS, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, 2 strategic countries with immense natural resources. At the 2024 SPIEF conference in St. Petersburg, Putin laid out the vision of de-dollarization and a BRICS currency that will be democratic and free from political coercion, sanctions, and abuse. At the BRICS summit in October this year in Russia, we will find out how many more countries will be joining BRICS. Within a year or two, the US will start to feel the pain of de-dollarization. Putin is very popular all over the developing nations, from Asia and Africa to Latin America. Even in Europe, many political groups support Russia and Putin. But the beautiful Garden of Europe is brutally oppressing free speech and democratic processes. The recent assassination attempt on Robert Fico, Slovakia's relatively pro-Russia prime minister, is a stark reminder of how ruthless these globalists are. Conclusion: this presidential term will be the most consequential for Vladimir Putin. He has the opportunity to leave behind a lasting legacy for Russia and the world. The first goal is, of course, survival. The evil American empire is waging a proxy war that presents an existential crisis for Russia. Thus, Putin must decisively win this battle and permanently neutralize the Ukrainian threat. This is a formidable military and geopolitical challenge. Second, Putin must work with Xi Jinping and other BRICS Plus leaders to defeat the American empire without World War III. Here is how to do it. First, expand BRICS to bring in all the large and strategic economies of the global south. 2. Create a BRICS currency and related financial tools that present robust alternatives to US dollar and SWIFT. Number 3. Work with China, India, and other Asian countries to develop a manufacturing base that enables any country to be completely independent of American goods and services. In summary, present an option for countries to be resilient and unafraid of U.S. sanctions. Then, all those countries should dump U.S. treasuries in unison. During his recent visit to China, Putin presented a holistic vision of a multipolar world. It was compelling and logical, a picture of a democratic global community of equal partners that is focused on development, infrastructure, trade, and connectivity, while peacefully following international rules and respecting civilizational diversity. That sounds not only wonderful, but is the only way forward. We are on the brink of welcoming a whole new chapter of history, which did not end in 1989. The end. And I'm your host, S.L. Canton. Please make sure to like and follow us on YouTube, Spotify, and follow me on Twitter X. My handle is @Canton2030. Thank you.